Imagine standing on a hillside in the year 476, watching smoke rise from a villa below. The mosaic floors within are cracking, the elaborate baths have fallen silent. An empire that ruled for 1,000 years is coming undone, not with a thunderous collapse, but like a great oak slowly returning to the earth. Rome, the eternal city, is falling, and with it, a way of life that once seemed permanent as the stars themselves. For centuries, Roman civilization had stretched across 3 continents, binding distant lands with roads straight as spear shafts, with aqueducts that made water flow uphill, with laws written in stone and recorded on wax tablets. In cities across the empire, citizens gathered in forums to debate philosophy, attended theatrical performances, purchased goods from Africa and India, and bathed in heated pools beneath painted ceilings. They lived by the written word, by complex legal contracts, by the certainty that their world would endure. And then it didn't. The barbarian tribes that Romans had long held at their borders, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Saxons, were not the savage hordes that Roman propaganda painted them to be. They were farmers and craftsmen, warriors and poets, with their own rich traditions passed down through song and story. They had traded with Rome, served in Roman armies, absorbed Roman customs, but they lived by different rhythms, honoured different gods, structured their societies around kinship rather than citizenship. When Rome's armies could no longer defend the frontiers, these Germanic peoples didn't so much invade as gradually occupy the spaces Rome could no longer hold. What followed was not darkness, but transformation, a metamorphosis as profound as any in nature. The great cities, those monuments to Roman power, began to empty. Without the tax system that had funded maintenance, without the trade networks that had supplied grain from Egypt, without the administrative apparatus that had coordinated everything, urban life became untenable. Stone buildings that had housed thousands stood hollow. Streets that had bustled with merchants grew silent. The complex machinery of empire ground to a halt. People moved to the countryside, to the old Roman villas and the Germanic settlements, creating communities that would define European life for the next 1,000 years. These were villages built on a human scale, places where everyone knew everyone, where life revolved around the seasons and the soil, where tradition bound people together more surely than any written law. Consider the transformation. A Roman citizen of the 4th century lived in a world of institutions, bureaucracies, and distant authorities. A villager of the 6th century lived in a world of personal relationships, local customs, and immediate realities. If a dispute arose, you didn't appeal to a distant judge, you brought your grievance before the village elders, or the local lord, or perhaps the travelling count who administered justice in the king's name. Law became something spoken and remembered, woven into the stories people told and the customs they observed. Germanic law codes began to blend with Roman traditions, creating something entirely new. The Salic law of the Franks, written down in Latin but preserving Germanic customs, established compensation payments for injuries rather than the harsh Roman penalties. The Visigothic code in Spain attempted to reconcile Roman sophistication with Gothic traditions. These weren't crude replacements for Roman law, they were adaptations, practical solutions for organizing societies without empire's infrastructure. But one Roman institution not only survived but flourished in this transformed world: the Christian Church. Christianity had spread through the late empire like roots through soil, establishing itself in every corner of Roman territory. When the empire fell, the church remained its bishops still resident in Old Roman cities, its priests serving rural communities, its monasteries scattered across the landscape like islands of learning in a sea of change. The church provided continuity in a discontinuous age. While kingdoms rose and fell, while languages evolved and populations migrated, the church endured. And within the monasteries, something extraordinary was happening. In scriptoria lit by candles and small windows, monks were preserving the wisdom of the ancient world. They copied manuscripts, not just Christian texts, but Roman classics, Greek philosophy, agricultural treatises, medical knowledge. Hour after patient hour, they replicated books by hand, illuminating pages with breathtaking artistry, ensuring that knowledge survived. Saint Benedict of Nursia established his monastery at Monte Cassino in the early 6th century, creating a rule that would shape monastic life for centuries to come. Prayer and work, ora et labora, became the rhythm of monastery life. Monks rose before dawn for the first of 8 daily prayer services, their voices chanting psalms in the darkness. Between prayers they worked in fields, in workshops, in the scriptorium. They cleared forests, drained swamps, cultivated lands. They became masters of agriculture, perfecting techniques that would feed medieval Europe. From Ireland, where Christianity had taken root with particular fervour, missionaries ventured forth to re-Christianize the continent. St. Columba founded Iona. St. Columbanus travelled to Francia and then Italy, establishing monasteries wherever he went. These Irish monks brought with them not just faith, but learning. They were among the few who still read Greek, who preserved literature that would otherwise have vanished forever. The conversion of Germanic peoples created a new Christian culture, neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but a synthesis of both. King Clovis of the Franks converted around 500, bringing his warriors with him to baptism. Ethelbert of Kent welcomed Augustine's mission from Rome in 597, beginning England's conversion. These kings didn't abandon their Germanic heritage. They transformed it, reinterpreting warrior values through Christian lens, establishing kingdoms that would claim divine sanction. Village life settled into rhythms determined by the sun and seasons. Spring brought ploughing and planting, everyone in the community working the Lord's fields before their own. Summer meant haymaking and the anxiety of watching crops grow, hoping for rain but not too much, for sun but not scorching heat. Autumn brought harvest, the culmination of the year's labour, the moment that determined whether the community would thrive or starve through winter. Winter itself was a time of relative rest, of indoor crafts, of storytelling around fires, of waiting for the world to wake again. These agricultural cycles became sacred rhythms. The Church Christianized them, blessing seeds at planting time, celebrating harvest with thanksgiving, marking the seasons with feast days. Candlemas in February marked winter's turning. Easter celebrated spring's resurrection. Lammas in August blessed the first fruits. Martinmas in November marked the slaughter of animals before winter. The year became a circle of celebrations, each one anchoring people to both the earth and heaven. Communities were small. A village might contain only 50 to 100 souls. Yet within that smallness lay intimacy and security. You knew everyone from birth. You worked beside the same people year after year. You married someone from your village or the next one over. Your horizons were limited, perhaps a few days' journey in any direction, but within those horizons, life had meaning woven from relationships and rituals. The village itself was carefully organized. Houses clustered together for protection and community, while fields spread around them in strips, each family holding scattered strips throughout the village's farmland, ensuring fair distribution of good and poor soil. Common lands provided pasture for everyone's animals. Forests offered firewood, building materials, food for pigs. Streams powered mills where grain became flour. At the centre of village life stood the manor, the estate of the local lord. The manorial system became Europe's organizing principle. Lords granted land to peasants in exchange for labour and a share of crops. Peasants gained protection and the right to work land they could pass to their children. It wasn't slavery, peasants weren't owned, but neither was it freedom as we understand it. It was mutual obligation, hierarchical but binding on all parties. The manor hall was where the lord held court, where justice was administered. where the community gathered for important announcements. Here, Germanic traditions of loyalty between lord and warrior blended with Roman concepts of landholding and obligation. A lord protected his people, led them in war if necessary, represented them to higher authorities. In return, peasants worked his fields, paid fees for using his mill or oven, or acknowledged his authority. Women's roles in these communities were essential, if often unrecorded. They managed households, raised children, tended gardens, preserved food, spun thread, wove cloth, brewed ale, cared for the sick. Noble women might manage entire estates when their husbands were away. Some widows controlled substantial lands. Abbesses ruled over double monasteries housing both monks and nuns, commanding respect and wielding genuine authority. Technology evolved to meet new needs. The heavy plough, appearing in northern Europe by the 6th century, could turn the thick, wet soils that Mediterranean ploughs couldn't touch. This innovation opened vast new farmlands for cultivation. Watermills multiplied, harnessing river power to grind grain, full cloth, or saw wood. By the 8th century, windmills began appearing, capturing even the air itself as energy. They weren't the technologies of empire, they were adaptations, practical solutions developed by communities for communities. The stirrup arrived in Europe from the East during these centuries, and with it, a warfare transformed. A rider with stirrups could deliver devastating charges without being unseated. This technical innovation helped create the medieval knight, the armored cavalry warrior who would dominate battlefields for centuries. The knight wasn't just a military role but a social one, the lowest rung of nobility, bound to his lord by oaths and granted land for service. Languages evolved during these centuries of transformation. Latin remained the language of church and learning, but the common speech diverged. In Francia, Latin mixed with Frankish influences, gradually becoming Old French. In Iberia, similar processes created the ancestors of Spanish and Portuguese. In Britain, Germanic Anglo-Saxon dominated, absorbing some Latin and Celtic words. In Italy, Latin evolved more conservatively but still changed. By the 8th or 9th century, these vernacular languages were distinct enough that a peasant in one region couldn't understand another, even though both descended from Latin. Yet despite linguistic diversity, despite political fragmentation into countless kingdoms and principalities, certain shared experiences unified medieval Europe. The agricultural calendar was universal. Everyone planted in spring and harvested in autumn. Christianity provided common beliefs, common rituals, common stories. The memory of Rome lingered like a ghost, a golden age that people looked back to with nostalgia, attempting sometimes to recreate its glory. In 793, ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, and Vikings raided the monastery at Lindisfarne, shattering the peace that had settled over northern Europe. These raids would continue for centuries, prompting the construction of castles, the fortification of towns, new forms of military organization. But that's another chapter in our story. For now, understand this. The centuries following Rome's fall were not an interruption of civilization, but its transformation. People adapted. They created communities scaled to human relationships. They preserved what was valuable from the past while innovating for their present needs. They built a world where local traditions mattered more than distant authorities, where the rhythm of seasons structured time, where community and custom provided security that empire once had. Stand again on that hillside, but now, in the year 800. The Roman villa below has been dismantled, its stones repurposed to build a village church. Fields surround it in neat strips. Smoke rises from clustered houses. You can hear the church bell marking the hours of prayer. Children play in the common area. In the manor hall, the lord is holding court, settling a dispute between neighbours. This is the medieval world being born intimate, traditional, deeply rooted in the soil and the sacred. A world that would endure for centuries, developing its own sophisticated culture, its own wisdom, its own remarkable achievements. A world that, in ways we'll discover, still shapes how we live today. The transformation was complete. From empire's ashes rose something unexpected: communities that would create one of history's most distinctive and enduring civilizations. There exists a medieval manuscript, illuminated with gold leaf and brilliant pigments, that depicts society as a tree. At its roots labor the peasants, bent over ploughs and scythes. Along its trunk stand the knights, armored and mounted, swords raised. And in its crown, reaching toward heaven, sit the clergy bishops with staffs, monks with books, priests with chalices raised toward God. This was how medieval people understood their world, not as individuals pursuing separate destinies, but as members of estates, each with sacred purpose, each dependent on the others, all parts of a divinely ordered whole. Those who work, those who fight, those who pray, oratories, bellatories, laboratories. 3 functions, 3 orders, 1 society. It was a beautiful theory. Reality, of course, was messier, richer, more complex than any diagram could capture. But this vision shaped medieval consciousness, influenced how people understood their place in the cosmos, justified the world as it existed. Let us enter each order, experience their lives from within, understand what it meant to inhabit medieval society. Begin in the monastery, before dawn, in the deepest hour of night. A bell rings sharp, clear, shattering sleep. In their dormitory, monks rise from narrow beds, still clothed in their habits, for they sleep dressed against the cold. They file silently through dark corridors toward the church, their breath visible in the chill air. This is Matins, the first of 8 daily prayer services that structure monastic time. The church interior flickers with candlelight. The monks take their places in the choir stalls, facing each other across the nave, and then they begin to chant ancient words, Latin verses, the Psalms of David sung in plainsong that echoes off stone walls. The human voice, unaccompanied, rises and falls in patterns perfected over centuries. This is Gregorian chant, named for Pope Gregory I, who supposedly organized these melodies 600 years earlier. It is music designed not for entertainment but for prayer, for lifting the soul toward the divine. Understand what is happening here. These monks are doing what they believe to be the most important work in the universe, interceding between humanity and God, praying for the salvation of souls, maintaining the spiritual health of Christendom through their constant devotion. They are specialists in the sacred, professionals of prayer, and medieval people consider their work essential. Kings endow monasteries, nobles grant lands, peasants pay tithes, all to support this ceaseless communication with heaven. After Matins comes Lauds at dawn, then Prime, Terce, Sext, None, Vespers, and finally Compline before sleep. 8 times daily, monks interrupt their work to pray. Between these offices they labor. In the scriptorium, some monks copy manuscripts, their fingers cramped around quills, eyes straining in inadequate light, creating books that will outlast kingdoms. In the infirmary, monk physicians tend the sick, applying knowledge gleaned from ancient texts and practical experience. In the kitchen, cooks prepare simple meals: bread, vegetables, fish on fast days, perhaps cheese and eggs. In the fields, working monks tend crops and animals, for monasteries must be self-sufficient. The rule of Saint Benedict governs everything: when to sleep, when to pray, when to eat, when to work. It prescribes silence during certain hours. It mandates hospitality to travellers. It requires monks to read daily, making monasteries centres of literacy when few outside their walls could read at all. Benedictine monasteries spread across Europe, creating a network of communities all following the same rule, all structured by the same rhythms. But monks were not the only clergy. In every parish church across Christendom, a priest served his community. These parish priests were different creatures from the educated monks, many barely literate, many poor, living among their parishioners, understanding local customs and superstitions. They baptized infants, blessed marriages, heard confessions, performed the Mass that transformed bread and wine into Christ's body and blood. They were mediators between the sacred and the profane, between heaven and earth, between God and the common people. The Mass itself was mystery and miracle. Conducted in Latin that most congregants couldn't understand, it followed ancient liturgy unchanged for centuries. At the moment of consecration, the priest elevated the host, and people believed they witnessed transubstantiation, bread literally becoming divine flesh. This was the sacrament that distinguished Christians from all others, the ritual that connected medieval villages to cosmic drama. Bishops ruled over dioceses, great territories encompassing many parishes. They were princes of the church, often from noble families, commanding wealth and power. They ordained priests, consecrated churches, held courts that judged moral and religious matters. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Reims, the Bishop of Rome, who was the Pope. These were figures of international significance, negotiating with kings, crowning emperors, shaping the politics of Christendom. Now, shift perspective. Leave the monastery's quiet devotion and enter the castle, the world of those who fight. The castle rises on a hill, stone walls thick as houses, towers reaching toward the sky, a drawbridge over a water-filled moat. This is both fortress and home, military installation and aristocratic residence. Within its walls lives the lord and his household knights who serve him, ladies who attend his wife, servants who maintain this complex operation, and during times of danger, peasants from surrounding villages seeking protection. The great hall is the castle's heart. Here the lord holds court, conducting the business of his domain. Petitioners present grievances. Vassals perform homage, kneeling before their lord, placing their hands between his, swearing oaths of loyalty. Messengers arrive with news from distant lands. During meals, trestle tables fill the hall, and the household eats together in hierarchical order. The lord and lady at the high table on a raised platform, knights and important retainers at lower tables, servants and lesser folk beyond. The food served reflects status. The lord might enjoy roasted peacock, elaborate meat dishes, imported spices, and white bread. Knights receive good but simpler fare. Servants eat porridge and brown bread. This is a world of visible hierarchy, where everything from seating to clothing to food proclaims your place in the social order. But let us follow a young knight through his day. He wakes in the castle's dormitory, where unmarried knights sleep communally. He dresses in layers, linen underclothes, a padded gambeson, then the mail hauberk that weighs 30 pounds, iron links riveted together into a shirt that covers from neck to knees. Over this he might wear a surcoat bearing his lord's colours. He buckles on sword, belt and dagger. He is a walking arsenal, his body transformed into a weapon. His training began in childhood. At 7, he left his father's house to serve as a page in another lord's castle, learning manners, beginning weapons practice with wooden swords. At 14, he became a squire, attending a knight, caring for armour and horses, accompanying his master to war. At 21, if he proved worthy, he was knighted in a ceremony that blended military and religious symbolism, vigil in the chapel, ritual bath symbolizing purification, blessing of sword and spurs, the dubbing where his lord struck him on the shoulder with a blade. Now he is a knight, lowest rank of nobility, but noble nonetheless. His function is violence, but sanctified violence, controlled by elaborate codes. He has sworn oaths to protect the church, defend the weak, show mercy to defeated enemies, be loyal to his lord. Whether knights actually lived by these ideals is questionable. Medieval chronicles are filled with knights pillaging, raping, murdering, but the ideal existed, shaping aspirations if not always behaviour. A tournament is being held, let us witness one. Lords from across the region gather, bringing their households. Pavilions rise like a temporary city, banners snap in the wind. In the lists, the tournament ground, knights display their prowess. Two riders face each other from opposite ends of the field, lances at ready, horses pawing the earth. A herald signals. They charge, hooves, thundering, lances lowering. The impact when they meet is tremendous. Lances shattering, one knight unhorsed, crashing to the ground in a clatter of metal. The victor circles, acknowledging the crowd's applause. Tournaments were training for war, displays of skill, but also social events. In the stands, ladies watch, and here courtly love begins to complicate the warrior culture. A knight might wear a lady's favour, a scrap of cloth tied to his arm. He fights to win her approval. Troubadours compose songs celebrating unattainable love, usually for a lord's wife, love that must remain unfulfilled, creating poetry of longing and devotion. The literature of courtly love transformed how nobility spoke about relationships. In the songs of Chrétien de Troyes, knights undertake impossible quests for their ladies. In the romance of Tristan and Isolde, illicit love leads to tragedy. In the legends of King Arthur and his Round Table, knights balance loyalty to their lord with devotion to Queen Guinevere. These were not realistic portrayals. They were ideals, fantasies, explorations of tensions between duty and desire. Real noble marriages had little to do with love. They were political alliances, economic arrangements, ways of binding families together or resolving conflicts. A daughter was valuable as a marriage prospect. Her wedding could end a feud, secure an ally, expand territory. She would meet her husband perhaps the day before the ceremony, marry him regardless of her feelings, bear his children to secure the succession, and manage his household with efficiency if not affection. Yet some women carved out remarkable roles. Eleanor of Aquitaine was Duchess in her own right, Queen of France, and then England, patron of troubadours, participant in the Second Crusade, mother of kings. She was exceptional but not unique. Powerful noblewomen managed estates, defended castles when their husbands were away, negotiated treaties, influenced politics. In the martial world of those who fight, women couldn't bear arms, but they wielded power nonetheless. Now descend from castle to village, from those who fight to those who work. The peasant's cottage is one room, walls of wattle and daub, roof of thatch, floor of packed earth. Smoke from the central hearth escapes through a hole in the roof since there is no chimney. The family sleeps together on straw mattresses, huddling under blankets in winter. There are few possessions, some wooden bowls, iron pots, simple tools, perhaps a chest for storing clothes. Animals might share the space, their body heat adding warmth. Life begins at dawn. The peasant, let us call him William, for it's a common name, eats a breakfast of bread and ale, then heads to the fields. Today is his day to work the Lord's demesne, the portion of the manor's land the Lord keeps for himself. 3 days each week, William must labour on the Lord's fields before he can work his own scattered strips. He resents this obligation, but it is custom, and custom has the force of law. He ploughs behind an ox, or if his lord is wealthy, a team of horses. The heavy plough cuts deep furrows in the heavy soil. His back aches, his hands blister. The sun climbs higher. There is no rest except for a brief meal at midday: bread, cheese, perhaps onions. By evening he is exhausted, but tomorrow he must do it again, and the day after, until the planting is finished. His wife, Alice, works equally hard. She tends the kitchen garden where vegetables grow: peas, beans, leeks, cabbages. She feeds the chickens that provide eggs, milks the cow, if they're fortunate enough to own one. She spins thread from wool or flax, an endless task. Women's spinning supported the medieval textile industry. The distaff, the tool that held unspun fibre, became synonymous with women's work, and the distaff side meant the female line of a family. Their children work too. Boys help in the fields as soon as they're able, learning agriculture through doing. Girls assist their mothers, learning household skills, preparing for their own futures as wives and mothers. Childhood as a separate, protected phase of life doesn't exist. Children are small adults, contributing to the household economy. The village year revolves around agricultural cycles. Spring planting of oats and barley in the fields left fallow the previous year. Summer haymaking, crucial for winter animal fodder. Autumn grain harvest, the most important time of year, everyone working frantically to gather crops before weather ruins them. The harvest determines everything. A good harvest means relative plenty, food stored against winter, perhaps surplus to sell. A bad harvest means hunger, perhaps starvation. Watching children weaken and die. 3-field crop rotation helps maximize production. One field grows winter wheat or rye, planted in autumn. Another grows spring crops, oats, barley, peas. The third lies fallow, recovering fertility, grazed by animals whose manure enriches soil. Each year the fields rotate, a system more productive than ancient 2-field rotation. This innovation, spreading across northern Europe during these centuries, allows population growth, supports more people on the same land. But life is precarious. Disease strikes without warning: dysentery, influenza, mysterious fevers. Accidents are common: a fall from a roof, a cart accident, infection from a simple cut. Women die in childbirth with appalling frequency. Infants die even more often. Half of children born might not reach age 5. Those who survive these dangers might live into their 40s or 50s, occasionally longer. Life expectancy at birth is perhaps 30 years, but if you survive childhood, you have a reasonable chance of seeing grandchildren. The manor court meets regularly, the lord or his steward presiding, hearing disputes between villagers, enforcing customs, punishing infractions. A man accused of stealing grain swears his innocence and produces oath helpers, neighbours who vouch for his character. A woman sues her neighbour over a boundary dispute. 2 men brawl and must pay fines. Justice is public, communal, based more on reputation and witness testimony than physical evidence. Obligations bind peasants to the land and lord. They cannot leave the manor without permission. They pay fees to use the lord's mill, the lord's oven, the lord's wine press. They give the lord a portion of their harvest. When a peasant dies, his best animal goes to the lord as a death tax. His second best animal goes to the church. These obligations feel oppressive to modern minds, yet they provide security. The lord protects his peasants, represents them to higher authorities, provides emergency relief during disasters. Religious festivals punctuate the work year, providing joy and release. At Christmas, even peasants feast meat slaughtered before winter, ale brewed strong, the village gathering in celebration. At Easter, winter's end brings relief and hope. Midsummer sees bonfires and dancing. Harvest home, when the last grain is gathered, prompts celebration and thanksgiving. On saints' days, people rest from labour, attend church, enjoy simple pleasures, games, gossip, courtship. Folk beliefs permeate peasant life alongside Christianity. People fear the evil eye, protect against it with charms. They believe in fairies who can bless or curse. They consult wise women who know healing herbs and spells. They interpret dreams, observe omens, perform rituals older than Christianity. The Church tolerates these practices uneasily, sometimes condemning them as superstition, sometimes absorbing them into Christian framework. Stories told around the hearth reveal the peasant imagination, tales of clever poor folk outwitting stupid nobles, stories of magical animals and enchanted forests. Reynard the Fox, trickster hero who survives through cunning. Robin Hood, the outlaw who steals from the rich to give to the poor, a fantasy of justice in an unjust world. These stories preserve peasant wisdom, teach lessons, provide entertainment during long winter evenings. The three orders, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, were interdependent. Peasants produced food that fed everyone. Knights provided military protection. Clergy prayed for all souls and preserved learning. Each order needed the others. The system worked, after a fashion, though those at the bottom surely recognized that the arrangement benefited those at the top far more than themselves. Yet hierarchy felt natural to medieval people in a way that's difficult for us to grasp. They believed God established social order, that everyone had their appointed place, that disrupting this order threatened cosmic harmony. A peasant might resent his lord, might complain about obligations, but he rarely questioned the system itself. That would come later, when plague and economic change shattered medieval certainties. For now, in the high medieval period, society functioned as a vast interlocking structure of obligations and expectations. The monk, praying in his church, the knight training with his sword, the peasant behind his plough, each performed their role in a divinely ordained drama. The world made sense. Everything had its place. Heaven watched over all. This was the social reality that shaped medieval consciousness. Hierarchical, communal, traditional, a world where birth determined destiny, where duty mattered more than individual desire, where the group took precedence over the person. It produced its own forms of beauty, its own wisdom, its own achievements, and it created a culture whose traces still linger in how we organize society, how we think about service and obligation, how we imagine the past. The three orders, three functions, one world, remarkably different from our own, yet still, in unexpected ways, the foundation on which our world was built. In the year 1144, Abbot Suger of Tarbes, Saint-Denis, stood in his newly renovated church and witnessed something that had never before existed in architecture. Light poured through stained glass windows in blues and reds and golds, transforming the interior into an otherworldly space. The walls seemed to dissolve. The stone vaulting soared impossibly high, held aloft by slender columns and revolutionary pointed arches. This was not merely a building, it was theology made visible, a glimpse of heaven constructed from earth and light. Suger had created the first Gothic church, and with it, he sparked an architectural revolution that would transform Europe's skyline. Within decades, cathedrals began rising in cities across Christendom: Chartres, Notre Dame, Canterbury, Cologne, Burgos, Milan, each attempting to reach higher, capture more light, create more sublime spaces for worship. These were not simple buildings. They were the most complex engineering projects of their age, consuming the labor of entire communities across generations, standing as prayers in stone that proclaimed medieval civilization's highest aspirations. Consider what it meant to build a cathedral. The decision often followed a crisis, a fire destroying the old church, a city's prosperity demanding grander expression, a bishop's ambition, or sometimes a miracle that drew pilgrims whose donations could fund construction. Once committed, the community embarked on an endeavor that might span a century or more. First came the master mason, a figure of extraordinary skill and knowledge. He understood geometry, mathematics, engineering principles learned through guild apprenticeship and practical experience. He designed the building, often drawing plans on plaster floors or parchment, calculating stresses and loads, determining how thick walls must be, where buttresses should stand, How to distribute weight so stone vaulting wouldn't collapse. The flying buttress was Gothic architecture's crucial innovation. Earlier, Romanesque churches required massive walls to support heavy stone roofs, but Gothic architects discovered they could channel weight through external supports, arched stone buttresses flying over side aisles to brace the main walls. This meant walls could be thinner, pierced with enormous windows. The structure became a skeleton of stone holding up a skin of glass. Quarries supplied limestone, sandstone, granite stonemasons shaping each block by hand with hammer and chisel. Carpenters constructed scaffolding and wooden forms called centering to support arches during construction. Metalworkers forged iron reinforcements. Glaziers created stained glass, an art of astonishing sophistication. They colored glass by adding metallic oxides during manufacture: cobalt for blue, copper for green, manganese for purple, gold for red. They painted details with ground glass and metallic oxides, then fired pieces in kilns. Finally, they assembled hundreds of colored fragments with lead strips into windows that told stories in light. The labor was immense. Stonecutters spent years carving blocks, each marked to show where it belonged in the structure. Laborers hauled materials using carts, cranes, ramps, and human muscle. Sculptors carved saints and angels, demons and gargoyles, plants and animals, entire encyclopedias of medieval knowledge carved into stone. Master craftsmen supervised armies of workers, coordinating efforts that required precision construction without modern tools or materials. Financing came from many sources. Bishops contributed church revenues. Kings and nobles made donations, sometimes substantial ones, buying spiritual merit and earthly prestige. Guilds, organizations of craftsmen and merchants, funded chapels dedicated to their patron saints. Common people gave what they could. At Chartres, tradition held that after fire destroyed the old cathedral in 1194, people from all social classes volunteered labor, nobility yoking themselves to carts hauling stone, commoners and aristocrats working side by side. The story may be exaggerated, but it captures something true. These buildings were community projects, collective acts of devotion. Step inside Notre Dame de Paris in its glory. Before the centuries and the fires, the entrance faces west, traditional orientation allowing the rising sun to illuminate the altar in the east. You pass through the portal where carved stone depicts the Last Judgment, Christ enthroned, angels and saints ascending on his right, the damned descending to hell on his left. The message is clear: choose wisely how you live. Inside, your eyes adjust to dimness punctuated by colored light. The nave stretches before you, columns rising to vaulted ceiling 35 meters above, higher than 10 houses stacked atop each other. The space makes you feel small but not diminished. Rather, it lifts your consciousness upward, directing attention toward heaven. This is intentional. Everything about Gothic architecture aims to inspire awe, to make worshippers feel they've entered sacred space distinct from the ordinary world. Light transforms the interior. Through rose windows and lancet windows, sunlight becomes sapphire blue, ruby red, emerald green. The windows themselves are picture books for the illiterate, biblical scenes rendered in glass, lives of saints, parables, and miracles. A peasant who cannot read can study these windows and learn scripture. A merchant can contemplate St. Nicholas, patron of commerce. A soldier can pray before St. George slaying the dragon. The cathedral teaches through image and symbol, through light and colour, through proportion and height. The altar stands at the east end, beneath the crossing where transepts intersect the nave. Here the Mass is celebrated, the central ritual of medieval Christianity performed daily. Behind the altar often lies the cathedral's most precious possession, relics of saints, perhaps fragments of bone encased in jeweled reliquaries, perhaps objects associated with holy figures. These relics draw pilgrims from across Europe, for people believe they possess miraculous power. Chartres Cathedral claimed to possess the Sancta Camisia, the tunic Mary wore when giving birth to Christ. Canterbury held the shrine of Thomas Becket, the archbishop murdered in his own cathedral in 1170. When miracles began occurring at his tomb, sick people healed, blind gaining sight, lame walking, Canterbury became one of Christendom's most important pilgrimage sites. The cathedral built to house Becket's shrine became a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its soaring vaults and brilliant windows proclaiming the saint's glory. Pilgrimage itself was central to medieval religious life. To go on pilgrimage meant to journey to a holy site, seeking blessing, healing, forgiveness, or simply fulfilling a vow. The three greatest pilgrimage destinations were Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, but countless lesser sites attracted pilgrims' local shrines, holy wells, places where saints had lived or miracles occurred. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela became a defining medieval journey. Legend held that the Apostle James preached in Spain, and his body was buried in Galicia. When his tomb was supposedly discovered in the 9th century, Santiago became a major pilgrimage site, attracting travelers from across Europe. The route to Santiago, the Camino de Santiago, developed infrastructure to support pilgrims. Monasteries provided lodging, hospitals treated the sick, bridges crossed rivers. Entire towns grew up serving pilgrims' needs. Walking the Camino might take months. Pilgrims wore distinctive garb, a staff for walking, a scrip or bag for provisions, a scallop shell badge identifying them as Santiago pilgrims. They travelled in groups for protection against bandits. They sang hymns and told stories. They visited churches along the route, venerating local relics. The journey itself became a spiritual exercise, a physical manifestation of the soul's journey toward God. Imagine undertaking such a pilgrimage. You're a merchant from Bruges who has prospered but feels guilt about sharp business practices. You've made a vow to walk to Santiago seeking forgiveness. You set out in spring when weather permits travel. Your family sees you off with tears and prayers, uncertain whether you'll return. The journey is dangerous. Pilgrims sicken and die far from home. You walk south through France, joining other pilgrims, forming temporary community with strangers united by shared destination. You pass through great cities, Paris, Tours, Bordeaux, where you visit cathedrals, marvel at their grandeur, pray before relics. You cross the Pyrenees into Spain, a difficult passage where some pilgrims perish from cold or falls. In Spanish kingdoms recently reconquered from Muslim rule, you see Islamic architecture repurposed for Christian worship, beautiful horseshoe arches and intricate tilework now serving new faith. Finally, after 3 months of walking, you reach Santiago. The cathedral rises before you, twin towers flanking the western facade. You enter, exhausted, exhilarated, weeping with relief. You approach the tomb of St. James, touch the marble column where millions of pilgrims before you have placed their hands, pray for forgiveness and blessing. The journey has transformed you not just spiritually but practically. You've seen the wider world, met people from distant lands, experienced cultural diversity. You've been educated by travel in ways that staying home could never provide. The pilgrimage routes became highways of cultural exchange. Ideas travelled along them, architectural innovations, artistic styles, theological concepts, political news, commercial information. Troubadours walked these routes, spreading songs from court to court. Scholars travelled to distant universities. Merchants moved goods between regions. The pilgrimage network knit together medieval Europe, creating connections that transcended political boundaries. While cathedrals rose and pilgrims walked, universities emerged as new centres of learning. These institutions developed from cathedral schools and monastic schools where clergy received education. In Bologna, legal studies attracted students from across Europe. In Paris, theology and philosophy flourished. In Oxford, masters and students formed communities dedicated to learning. Salamanca, Padua, Cambridge by the 13th century, dozens of universities operated, all following similar organizational principles. The university was a guild of scholars and students, legally recognized, with rights and privileges. Students came in their teens, studying first the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. These 7 subjects formed the foundation of medieval education. Masters lectured, reading aloud from authoritative texts, Aristotle, the Church Fathers, legal codes, then commenting on them, explaining difficult passages, exploring implications. Scholasticism became the dominant intellectual method. Scholars posed questions, presented arguments pro and con, then synthesized conclusions using logical reasoning. Peter Abelard's sic et non, yes and no, collected contradictory statements from authorities on various topics, forcing students to reconcile apparent contradictions through careful reasoning. Thomas Aquinas would perfect this method in his Summa Theologica, attempting to reconcile Christian faith with Aristotelian philosophy, creating elaborate logical structures that addressed every conceivable theological question. The recovery of Aristotle transformed medieval thought. For centuries, Western Europe knew only fragments of Greek philosophy, but in Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars interacted, translation movements flourished. Muslim scholars had preserved and commented on Aristotle in Arabic translations. Jewish scholars like Maimonides engaged with this tradition. Christian scholars, learning from both, began translating these works into Latin. Toledo became a crucial center for translation. After Christian kingdoms reconquered it in 1085, Toledo's libraries contained treasures, Arabic manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. Scholars gathered there, working in teams, often a Jewish or Muslim scholar translating from Arabic to Castilian, a Christian scholar translating from Castilian to Latin. Through their labor, Aristotle returned to Western Europe, along with mathematical treatises, astronomical tables, and medical knowledge. This intellectual flowering revolutionized European thought. Aristotle's works on logic, natural philosophy, ethics, and politics provided comprehensive frameworks for understanding reality. His empirical approach, observing nature, classifying phenomena, seeking causes, introduced new methods. His metaphysics raised profound questions about substance and essence, form and matter, potentiality and actuality. Medieval scholars spent centuries absorbing, debating, and building upon Aristotelian foundations. Mathematics advanced through Arabic numerals and concepts introduced via these translations. Europeans had used Roman numerals adequate for some purposes, but cumbersome for calculation. Arabic numerals, actually originating in India but transmitted through Islamic civilization, included a revolutionary concept, 0. This placeholder, allowing positional notation, made complex calculations possible. Leonardo Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, published in 1202, introduced these numerals to European merchants and scholars, transforming commerce and science. Medicine benefited enormously from translated texts. Works by Avicenna, the great Islamic physician and philosopher, became standard medical textbooks in European universities. His Canon of Medicine synthesized Greek medical knowledge with Islamic innovations, describing diseases, treatments, surgical procedures. The medical school at Salerno, influenced by Islamic medical knowledge, became Europe's premier institution for medical education. Universities trained the professional class that administered medieval society, lawyers who wrote contracts and settled disputes, physicians who treated the sick, theologians who guided spiritual life, teachers who educated the next generation. But universities also became sites of intellectual ferment, where new ideas challenged old assumptions, where scholars pushed boundaries of what could be known and discussed. Some scholars turned inward, seeking direct experience of the divine. Mysticism flourished in this period, producing extraordinary figures like Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098, Hildegard entered a monastery as a child. She experienced visions throughout her life, detailed, symbolic experiences she believed came from God. In her 40s, she began recording these visions in texts illustrated with remarkable images. She composed music of haunting beauty, wrote on natural history and medicine, corresponded with popes and emperors, founded 2 monasteries. She was theologian, scientist, artist, administrator, a polymath who claimed divine inspiration for her authority. Hildegard's music represents medieval culture's creative heights. Her compositions use extended melodic lines, wider ranges than typical chant, and vivid text imagery. O Viridissima Virga, O greenest branch celebrates Mary with botanical metaphors. O Ignis Spiritus Paracleti, O fire of the Spirit, invokes the Holy Spirit as living flame. This is music of intense spirituality, designed to transport listeners toward transcendent experience. Other mystics followed. Francis of Assisi, renouncing his wealthy merchant family, embraced poverty and preached to birds and animals, seeing God's presence in all creation. His Canticle of the Sun praised Brother Sun and Sister Moon, celebrating the natural world as divine revelation. The Franciscan order he founded emphasized poverty, simplicity, and direct spiritual experience, attracting followers who sought alternatives to institutional religion's complexities. Meister Eckhart, a 14th-century Dominican, preached sermons in German that explored mystical union with God. Julian of Norwich experienced visions of Christ's Passion, writing Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English, written by a woman. These mystics sought to experience divine presence directly, to transcend ordinary consciousness, to achieve union with the sacred. The flowering of faith in the high medieval period produced astonishing achievements. Cathedrals that still inspire awe 7 centuries later, intellectual traditions that shaped Western thought, mystical writings of profound depth, pilgrimage traditions that connected distant communities. This was civilization expressing its deepest values through stone and glass, through scholarship and song, through devotion and discipline. Stand in Chartres Cathedral as afternoon light streams through the rose window. Blue glass donated by the Drapers Guild dominates blue, representing heaven, Mary's colour, the colour of transcendence. The window depicts Mary enthroned in heaven, surrounded by angels and saints. The light falls on worn stone floors, on walls that have stood for 8 centuries, on the faces of visitors from around the world who still come seeking something difficult to name: beauty, transcendence, connection to something greater than themselves. This is medieval civilization's gift to the ages, the conviction that human creativity, when directed toward the sacred, can create works of enduring magnificence, that communities working together across generations can achieve what no individual could accomplish. That faith, for all its complications and contradictions, can inspire humanity's noblest efforts. The cathedrals still stand, their stones still proclaim medieval dreams, the pilgrim routes still draw travellers, the universities still teach, the music still moves listeners to tears, the mystical writings still speak to seekers, the flowering of faith produced fruit that nourishes us still. A medieval person walking through a forest did not see what we see. Where we observe trees, soil, animals, biological systems, they saw a text written by God, every element laden with meaning, every creature teaching a moral lesson. The oak symbolized strength and endurance, the lily represented purity. The pelican, believed to pierce its own breast to feed young with its blood, embodied Christ's sacrifice. The world was not merely physical, it was a vast symbolic system, and learning to read it properly was essential for understanding one's place in creation. This symbolic consciousness permeated every aspect of medieval life. Numbers carried meaning. 3 represented the Trinity, 4 the evangelists and elements, 7 the virtues and sacraments, 12 the apostles and tribes of Israel. Colors signified spiritual states: white for purity, red for martyrdom and passion, green for hope, black for sin and death. Even positions in space held significance. Right was blessed, left was sinister. Above meant heavenly, below meant earthly or diabolic. The medieval cosmos itself was a nested hierarchy of meaning. Earth sat at the center, surrounded by crystalline spheres carrying the moon, planets, sun, and stars. Beyond these wheeled the primum mobile, the first moved, which set all other spheres in motion. And beyond that lay the Empyrean, the realm of pure light where God and the saints dwelled in eternal bliss. This was Ptolemaic cosmology, received from ancient Greece, Christianized and elaborated by medieval scholars. But this was not merely abstract astronomy. The heavens influenced earthly events through astrology, which medieval people considered legitimate science. Physicians consulted astrological charts before treatments, determining which constellations governed which organs, when bleeding should occur, which herbs would be most effective. Kings planned coronations and battles according to favorable planetary alignments. Merchants timed business ventures to celestial rhythms. The boundary between astronomy and astrology, between observation and interpretation, remained porous. The human body itself was a microcosm, a little world reflecting the greater cosmos. 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, corresponded to the 4 elements of earth, air, fire, water. Health meant balanced humours. Illness meant imbalance. A person with excess blood was sanguine, optimistic, sociable, ruddy-faced. Excess phlegm made one phlegmatic, calm, sluggish, pale. Too much yellow bile produced a choleric temperament, angry, ambitious, yellowish. Black bile caused melancholy, depressive, artistic, darkly complexioned. Medical treatment aimed to restore balance. Bleeding, the most common intervention, reduced excess blood. Purging cleared digestive systems. Special diets adjusted humoral balance. Hot foods for cold conditions, moist foods for dry. Herbs carried their own qualities. Ginger was hot and dry, good for cold, moist conditions. Lettuce was cold and moist, suitable for hot, dry ailments. This humoral medicine, inherited from Galen and elaborated by Islamic physicians, shaped medical practice for centuries. Pain and illness held spiritual significance. Suffering might be divine punishment for sin, requiring confession and penance. It might be a test of faith, like Job's trials. It might be diabolic assault, demanding exorcism or prayer, physical and spiritual healing intertwined. A sick person sought both physician and priest, herbal remedies and holy relics, medical intervention and miraculous intervention. The categories we separate: natural and supernatural, body and soul. Medieval people experienced as unified. Dreams were messages requiring interpretation. Biblical precedent established this. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Daniel explaining Nebuchadnezzar's visions. Medieval dream interpretation drew from classical sources like Artemidorus and Christian tradition. Dreams of flying might signify pride or spiritual ascent. Dreams of water could portend emotional turmoil or baptismal grace. Recurring dreams demanded particular attention, possibly revealing divine will or warning of danger. The calendar organized time into sacred cycles. The liturgical year began with Advent, 4 weeks of preparation before Christmas's celebration of Christ's birth on December 25th. Epiphany, on January 6th, commemorated the Magi's visit. Lent's 40 days of fasting and penance led to Easter, Christianity's greatest feast celebrating resurrection. Pentecost, 50 days after Easter, marked the Holy Spirit's descent. Trinity Sunday, Corpus Christi, the Assumption of Mary. The year progressed through feast days, each with special observances, particular liturgies, distinctive customs. Saints' days dotted the calendar like jewels. Every day belonged to one or more saints, their feast days celebrated in churches bearing their names, by guilds claiming them as patrons, in regions where they worked miracles. St. Nicholas on December 6th brought gifts to children. St. Valentine on February 14th, a martyred priest, became associated with courtly love. St. George on April 23rd, the dragon-slaying knight, inspired warriors. St. John's Eve on June 23rd saw bonfires lit, herbs gathered, fortune-telling performed. The agricultural year overlapped the liturgical calendar, creating dual rhythm. Candlemas, on February 2nd, 40 days after Christmas, marked winter's midpoint when candles were blessed, but also when farmers assessed seed stores for spring planting. May Day celebrations of spring's arrival, with maypoles and flower, crowns, mingled pagan fertility rites with Christian observances. Lammas on August 1st, meaning loaf mass, blessed bread from the first wheat harvest. Michaelmas on September 29th, feast of the Archangel Michael, coincided with autumn tasks fattening geese, preparing for winter. Carnival, the period before Lent, allowed licensed transgression. Social hierarchies inverted, peasants mocked nobles, servants commanded masters, everything turned upside down. People wore masks and costumes, they held mock trials and absurd processions, they feasted extravagantly before Lent's austerity. Carnival provided safety valve for social tensions, temporary reversal that ultimately reinforced normal order by demonstrating the chaos that would reign without it. Mystery plays brought biblical stories to street and square. Guilds performed plays on pageant wagons, rolling stages that moved through town, stopping at designated locations. The cycle might begin with creation gods speaking the world into existence, angels rebelling, Lucifer cast down. It continued through Old Testament stories, Noah's flood with real water and mechanical animals, Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac, Moses and the plagues of Egypt. The New Testament received elaborate treatment, nativity scenes with live animals, Herod raging comically, Christ's passion performed with graphic realism, resurrection celebrated with joy. These performances educated illiterate audiences in Scripture, but they also entertained. Comic relief appeared in unlikely places. Noah's wife refusing to board the ark, becoming a stock figure of female stubbornness. Herod ranted and threatened absurdly, becoming a type of the tyrannical buffoon. Demons capered and seized the damned with dark humor. Sacred and profane mixed freely, reverence and irreverence coexisting in ways that might shock modern sensibilities but felt natural to medieval audiences. Arthurian romance captured medieval imagination like no other literature. The legends of King Arthur and his Round Table Lancelot's prowess, Gawaine's courtesy, Percival's quest for the Holy Grail, Guinevere's beauty, Mordred's betrayal explored tensions between feudal loyalty and romantic love, between Christian virtue and warrior honor, between earthly glory and spiritual salvation. These were not historical accounts, but mirrors reflecting idealized medieval values and anxieties. Chrétien de Troyes, writing in 12th century France, shaped Arthurian legend's literary form. His Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, explored forbidden love between Arthur's greatest knight and his queen. His Perceval, the story of the Grail, introduced the Grail quest, transforming Celtic cauldron legend into Christian mystical symbol. Later writers elaborated German poets, English chroniclers, French romancers, each adding layers, creating sprawling narrative cycles that occupied years of composition and performance. The Grail became medieval Christianity's supreme symbol, a cup, sometimes said to be the chalice Christ used at the Last Supper, sometimes the vessel catching his blood at crucifixion, sometimes a mysterious object radiating divine presence. Knights sought it through dangerous adventures, enchanted forests, mysterious castles. Only the pure could achieve it. Percival, innocent and pious, came close. Galahad, Lancelot's son, conceived in sin but himself sinless, succeeded. The quest represented spiritual journey, the soul's search for divine grace, the knight's transformation from earthly warrior to spiritual champion. Courtly love literature, alongside Arthurian romance, established conventions that influenced Western literature for centuries. The lover served his lady as a vassal serves his lord, performing deeds to win her favour. She remained distant, often unattainable, married to another, inspiring devotion that could never be consummated. This created poetry of longing, songs of unfulfilled desire, elaborate codes of proper behaviour, how to approach a lady, how to declare love, how to accept rejection gracefully. Troubadours in southern France perfected this art. Bernard de Ventadorn sang of love's sweet pain. Beatrice de Dea, one of the few known female troubadours, wrote from the woman's perspective, reversing expected roles. Their songs spread north to Trouvères in France, Minnesingers in Germany, eventually influencing all European vernacular poetry. Dante's Beatrice, Petrarch's Laura, countless literary ladies all descended from troubadour conventions. But alongside courtly sophistication existed robust folk culture. Fabliaux, short, comic tales in verse offered earthier fare. These stories mocked pretension, celebrated clever peasants outwitting stupid nobles, featured cuckolded husbands and unfaithful wives, priests caught in compromising positions, merchants cheated by their own greed. They were bawdy, irreverent, funny reminders that medieval culture contained multitudes, high and low, sacred and profane. Folk songs accompanied work and celebration. Harvesting songs paced labour and lifted spirits. Spinning songs helped women through tedious tasks. Dance tunes set feet moving at festivals. Lullabies soothed infants. Each activity had its music, passed down orally, evolving through countless performances, preserving community memory and identity. Herbal knowledge sustained communities. Wise women sometimes respected healers, sometimes suspected witches knew which plants cured which ailments. Willow bark reduced fever and pain, containing compounds related to modern aspirin. Foxglove treated heart conditions, dangerous in wrong doses but effective when properly used. Chamomile soothed digestion. Lavender calmed nerves. This wasn't superstition, it was practical botany, empirical knowledge accumulated through generations of observation and experiment. But herbal healing coexisted with magical thinking. Some believed certain herbs must be gathered at specific times, mandrake at midnight, verveine at midsummer. Spoken charms accompanied treatments, words inherited from pre-Christian tradition, sometimes barely comprehensible, preserved because they worked. Amulets protected against evil eye and illness. Holy relics cured diseases. The boundary between medicine and magic remained undefined. Omens and portents revealed future events. Comets signaled disaster. Eclipses warned of political upheaval. Strange births, two-headed calves, conjoined twins presaged divine judgment. Birds' behaviour predicted weather and fortune. Seeing a lone magpie meant sorrow. Two meant joy. A crow cawing on the left was bad luck, on the right was good. Modern people might smile at such beliefs, but for medieval folk, reading signs was practical necessity, a way of navigating uncertain world. Proverbs preserved traditional wisdom. A stitch in time saves 9. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Look before you leap. These compressed life lessons, teaching prudence, patience, foresight. They were pedagogical tools, ways of passing knowledge to children, settling disputes with appeal to collective wisdom. A person who knew many proverbs and deployed them aptly gained respect for sagacity. Riddles tested wit and entertained. What has roots nobody sees, is taller than trees. Up, up it goes, yet never grows. A mountain. What runs but never walks, has a mouth but never talks, has a bed but never sleeps. A river. Riddle contests appeared in literature and life, demonstrating cleverness, providing mental exercise during long winter evenings. The medieval mind thought analogically, finding correspondences everywhere. The church was Christ's body, with him as head, clergy as soul, laity as limbs. The king was father to his people. The Lord was shepherd to his flock. These weren't mere metaphors. They were ways of understanding relationships, of seeing patterns connecting different realms of experience. Everything visible pointed toward invisible truths. Sacraments were visible signs of invisible grace. Water in baptism, washing away sin, bread and wine becoming Christ's body and blood, marriage joining man and woman as Christ joined with the church. The physical world was sacramental, revelatory, always directing attention beyond itself towards spiritual realities. This worldview produced remarkable cultural achievements, complex theological systems, sophisticated literary traditions, practical wisdom encoded in proverb and custom. But it also created anxieties. If everything meant something, then nothing could be taken at face value. Dreams required interpretation. Illness demanded diagnosis of spiritual and physical causes. Natural events might signal divine will or diabolic interference. Fear of demons was real and constant. Medieval people believed invisible spiritual warfare raged continuously around them. Devils tempted humans towards sin, caused nightmares, possessed the vulnerable, haunted ruins and crossroads. Protection required vigilance prayers at bedtime, holy water sprinkled, crosses made against danger, saints invoked for aid. Yet alongside fear existed wonder. The world was enchanted, alive with meaning, responsive to prayer and ritual. Saints intervened in daily life. Miracles happened. God watched over everything, aware of every sparrow's fall, every human thought. This could be terrifying. God also judged and punished, but it meant existence had purpose, that individual lives mattered in cosmic drama, that the universe was fundamentally meaningful. Understanding the medieval mind requires setting aside modern assumptions that the world operates by impersonal natural laws, that meaning is constructed, not discovered, that science and religion occupy separate spheres. Medieval people lived in a cosmos where everything connected, where matter and spirit intertwined, where symbols revealed truth, where stories taught wisdom, where seasons marked sacred time. Their world was smaller than ours geographically, but vaster imaginatively. They inhabited universe stretching from hell's depths through earth's trials to heaven's glories, populated by angels and demons, saints and sinners, enchanted beasts and speaking objects. They lived in eternal present, where biblical past remained vivid and apocalyptic future felt imminent. They were embedded in communities and traditions that gave identity and purpose. This was medieval consciousness, symbolic, hierarchical, communal, enchanted. It produced art and literature of enduring power, systems of thought of remarkable sophistication, ways of living that sustained civilization through centuries. And it left traces in our own minds in fairy tales that still captivate children, in metaphors that structure thought, in yearnings for meaning and connection that persist despite modernity's disenchantment. The medieval mind saw what we have largely forgotten, that the world can be read as well as measured, that existence overflows with significance, that reality has depths our instruments cannot probe. Whether we judge their vision true or false matters less than understanding. It shaped a civilization and echoes still in how we imagine, dream, and seek understanding. In October of 1347, ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina, carrying more than cargo and sailors. They carried death. Within days, people began falling ill with fever, chills, and swellings in the groin and armpits buboes that gave the plague its name. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Within months, the disease spread across Europe like wildfire, consuming dry timber. By the time it exhausted itself 4 years later, perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population had perished, 25 million people dead, communities shattered, the medieval world fundamentally transformed. The Black Death, as later generations would call it, was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas living on black rats. But medieval people knew nothing of bacteria or disease vectors. They sought explanations in the frameworks they possessed. Divine punishment for sin, astrological conjunction of planets creating poisonous miasma, Jewish conspiracies to poison wells, bad air from earthquakes releasing underground vapors. Every explanation pointed towards spiritual or cosmic causes, for how else could such catastrophe be understood? Imagine living through it. You're a baker in Avignon, and you notice the first signs: fever, terrible thirst, swellings appearing in your groin. You know what this means. You've seen neighbors die within days, their bodies turning black, their final hours agonizing. You send for the priest to hear your confession, for you believe you're dying and must prepare your soul. Your wife weeps. Your children huddle frightened. The priest comes, face wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar and herbs, believing this might protect him. He administers last rites, anointing with oil, final prayers, commending your soul to God. Perhaps you survive. About 60% died, but some recovered, often marked by scars where buboes had burst. If you survive, you emerge into a transformed city. Streets that bustled with life now echo emptily. Houses stand vacant, their inhabitants dead or fled. Bodies lie unburied, because gravediggers cannot keep pace. The normal rhythms of life have collapsed. Markets don't open, courts don't convene. Even churches sometimes close, their priests dead or terrified. The social order fractures. With so many dead, labour becomes scarce and valuable. Peasants who survive demand higher wages, refuse traditional obligations, move to cities seeking opportunity. Lords, accustomed to compliant workers, face rebellion when they try enforcing old terms. The Statute of Labourers in England, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, breeds resentment that will explode in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Economic transformation follows. Demographic catastrophe. With fewer mouths to feed, marginal farmland reverts to forest and pasture. Landlords shift from grain to sheep, requiring fewer workers. Villages empty and disappear. But survivors often prosper, inheriting from multiple dead relatives, commanding higher wages, accessing goods previously beyond their means. The decades after the plague see rising living standards for common people, a silver lining to apocalyptic cloud. Religious responses to the plague reveal medieval spirituality's complexity and desperation. Some interpret death as divine punishment requiring intensified devotion. The flagellant movement spread across Europe, groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, processing from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for collective sin. They march in formation, chanting hymns, then stop to perform their ritual, stripping to the waist, flogging their backs with leather scourges embedded with iron points until blood flows. They believe their suffering will appease God's wrath, convince him to lift the pestilence. The Church views flagellants with suspicion. These movements operate outside ecclesiastical authority, claiming direct relationship with God, sometimes preaching that priests and sacraments are unnecessary for salvation. This threatens church power and orthodoxy. Popes condemn flagellant movements, but they persist, expressing popular religious fervor that established institutions cannot contain or satisfy. Other responses turn darker, seeking scapegoats for inexplicable catastrophe. Many blame Jews. In cities across Europe, Jewish communities face accusations of poisoning wells, causing plague through demonic conspiracy. Mobs attack Jewish quarters, burning people alive, massacring entire communities. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews are burned. In Mainz, 6,000 perish. The papacy issues bulls condemning these massacres, declaring Jews innocent, but local authorities often ignore Rome, sometimes participating in violence themselves. These pogroms reveal medieval anti-Semitism's deep roots. Jews lived as minorities in Christian Europe, legally restricted in where they could live and what professions they could practice. Barred from guilds and land-owning, many entered money-lending, which Christians considered sinful usury but economic necessity. This made Jews economically valuable but socially vulnerable, resented for charging interest, useful enough to protect in normal times, expendable when fear and fury needed outlet. Yet Jewish communities had enriched medieval culture profoundly. Jewish scholars preserved ancient texts, translated Arabic works into Latin, contributed to medicine, philosophy, and science. Rashi's biblical commentaries influenced Christian interpreters. Maimonides' philosophical works engaged Christian scholastics. Jewish physicians served Christian nobles. In Spain, before Christian reconquest completed, Jews participated in cultural flowering that blended Islamic, Jewish, and Christian traditions. The plague also inspired artistic response, the dance of death or danse macabre. In paintings, woodcuts, and poems, skeletal death leads people from all social ranks in a dance toward the grave. Pope and peasant, emperor and beggar, beautiful maiden and learned scholar all dance with death as equal partner. These images proclaimed mortality's universality, hierarchy's meaninglessness before the grave. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Memento mori, remember death, for it comes for all. This awareness of mortality's imminence intensified personal religious devotion. People sought more direct emotional relationships with God, rather than relying solely on church mediation. Mysticism flourished, individuals experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, feeling God's presence immediately. Some mystics, like Catherine of Siena, gained significant influence, advising popes and princes, their spiritual authority, transcending their humble social origins. Vernacular religious literature expanded, bringing spirituality into common languages. Previously, religious texts existed primarily in Latin, accessible only to educated clergy. Now, devotional works appeared in Italian, French, English, German. People could pray and read scripture in their own tongues. This democratization of religious experience would eventually contribute to Reformation movements. But even in the 14th and 15th centuries, it shifted power dynamics, reducing clergy's monopoly on sacred knowledge. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, written in Italian rather than Latin, exemplifies this vernacular revolution. His epic journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, guided by the Roman poet Virgil and his beloved Beatrice, synthesizes medieval theology, classical learning, and personal vision into magnificent poetry. Dante populates his afterlife with contemporary figures, popes in hell for corruption, personal enemies suffering appropriate punishments, admired figures in paradise. This is profoundly medieval, the eternal interpenetrating the temporal, individual lives mattering in cosmic scheme, poetry conveying philosophical and theological truth. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English, brings 14th century England to vivid life. His pilgrims travelling to Becket's shrine represent medieval society's cross-section knight and miller, prioress and wife of Bath, pardoner and ploughman. Each tells a story revealing character, class attitudes, and cultural values. The tales range from courtly romance to bawdy fabliaux, from pious legend to mock-heroic animal fable. Chaucer captures medieval worlds' full complexity, devotional and earthy, idealistic and cynical, hierarchical, yet recognizing common humanity. The rise of vernacular literature accompanied increasing lay literacy. More people learned to read, though still a minority. Books laboriously copied by hand remained expensive, but less so than earlier. Wealthy lay people commissioned books of hours, devotional books with prayers for each canonical hour, illustrated magnificently. The Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, created in the early 15th century, exemplifies the form's artistic heights, calendar illuminations showing seasonal activities in brilliant color, prayers accompanied by exquisite paintings of biblical scenes. These books allowed private devotion, personal spiritual practice separate from communal worship. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, revolutionized knowledge dissemination. Gutenberg's Bible, printed in 1455, demonstrated the technology's potential. Suddenly, books could be produced in quantities and at costs unimaginable previously. A manuscript Bible required years of scribal labor. A printed Bible required days on the press. This didn't immediately transform society. Early printing was expensive. Literacy remained limited, but it established infrastructure for information revolution that would reshape civilization. Yet, medieval culture's late flowering produced remarkable achievements even as old certainties crumbled. The Burgundian court in the 15th century became Europe's cultural center, its dukes commissioning art and music of extraordinary sophistication. Polyphonic music reached new heights, multiple melodic lines, weaving together in complex harmony. Guillaume Dufay and Josquin des Prez composed masses and motets of breathtaking beauty, voices intertwining in mathematical precision and emotional expressiveness. This polyphony emerged from earlier developments. Gregorian chant was monophonic single melodic line, all voices singing the same notes. But by the 9th century, musicians experimented with organum, adding second voice moving in parallel intervals. By the 13th century, composers created increasingly complex polyphony, 3 or 4 or more voice parts, each with distinct melody, combining according to rules of counterpoint. The result was music of previously impossible richness, sound architecture as complex as Gothic cathedrals. Secular music flourished alongside sacred. Courtly entertainments featured elaborate pageantry masks with allegorical figures, tournaments with themes from Romance literature, banquets where food sculptures depicted mythological scenes. Music accompanied everything: dancing, dining, ceremonial processions. Minstrels and jongleurs travelled from court to court, performing songs and instrumental pieces, juggling and telling tales, bringing entertainment and news. In cities, mystery and miracle plays evolved into more sophisticated theatrical forms. Morality plays like Everyman used allegorical characters, Everyman representing humanity, death summoning him to judgment, fellowship and goods abandoning him, good deeds accompanying him to heaven. These plays taught moral lessons through engaging drama, showing audiences how to live virtuously, how to prepare for death, how to prioritize eternal salvation over earthly pleasure. Heretical movements challenged church authority more directly. John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia questioned papal power, criticized clerical corruption, argued that Scripture alone, not church tradition, should guide Christian belief. Wycliffe's followers, called Lollards, preached in English, translated the Bible into vernacular, rejected transubstantiation and clerical celibacy. Huss, influenced by Wycliffe, sparked movement in Bohemia that combined religious reform with Czech nationalism. The Church responded harshly. Huss was summoned to the Council of Constance, promised safe conduct, then arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1415. His followers rebelled, sparking the Hussite Wars, decades of conflict between Czech reformers and Catholic forces. These wars prefigured the Reformation, demonstrating that challenges to church authority could mobilize popular support and resist suppression. Heresy trials and inquisitions expanded church power to investigate and punish unorthodoxy. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century to combat Cathar heresy in southern France, developed procedures for identifying and prosecuting heretics: interrogation, torture to extract confessions, execution by burning for unrepentant heretics. The Holy Office operated with papal authority, independent of local bishops, answerable only to Rome. It claimed to save souls by destroying bodies before heresy could spread and contaminate others. Yet alongside repression, genuine spiritual hunger drove religious movements. The Devotio Moderna, or modern devotion, emerging in the Netherlands, emphasized personal piety, meditation on Christ's life, practical charity, and education. Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, written from this tradition, became one of Christianity's most influential devotional works, counseling humility, self-examination, and inner spiritual life rather than external observances. Women's religious roles expanded in complex ways. Formal church offices remained closed to women, no female priests or bishops, but other paths to spiritual authority existed. Some women became anchoresses, walling themselves into cells attached to churches, devoting lives to prayer and contemplation. Julian of Norwich, an anchoress, experienced visions she recorded in Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English by a woman. Her theology emphasized God's love rather than judgment, offering hope in plague-devastated world. Beguines, women living in religious communities without taking formal vows, created alternative to both marriage and convent. They supported themselves through textile work, cared for sick and poor, practiced devotional lives while maintaining relative independence. Church authorities viewed them suspiciously, women outside male authority, reading scripture, teaching for each other. Some Beguines faced heresy charges, but communities persisted, demonstrating women's determination to create spaces for spiritual expression. The late medieval period thus presents paradox, crisis and creativity, catastrophe and cultural achievement, religious turmoil and spiritual deepening. The Black Death shattered confidence in old certainties, yet survivors built new social arrangements. Church authority faced unprecedented challenges, yet genuine piety flourished. Traditional hierarchies weakened, yet art and literature reached new heights. This was medieval civilization's autumn decline from summer's glory, but autumn's own peculiar beauty. Like leaves turning brilliant colors before falling, late medieval culture produced works of astonishing beauty and depth, even as the world that created them was passing. The certainties that had structured medieval consciousness for centuries were crumbling, but the replacements, Renaissance humanism, Protestant Reformation, scientific revolution, overseas exploration were just beginning to emerge. Stand in a city square in 1450. The plague has passed but will return repeatedly. The empty houses remind you that death comes suddenly. In the church, the dance of death painting shows skeletons claiming kings and beggars alike. Yet life continues, the market operates, children play, lovers court. The printing shop produces books that will spread new ideas. The cathedral still stands, its stones defying mortality. Music echoes from the Duke's Palace complex polyphony, celebrating human creativity. Medieval civilization is transforming, the old world dying, something new being born. The crisis of belief has not destroyed faith but reshaped it, made it more personal, more questioning, more aware of human fragility. The transformation will continue, accelerating, eventually producing modernity. But for now, in this moment of transition, the medieval spirit endures, seeking meaning in suffering, creating beauty amid destruction, maintaining hope despite catastrophe. The autumn of the Middle Ages was approaching winter, but winter would bring its own kind of wisdom, and beyond winter, spring would come again. In the palace of the Duke of Burgundy at Dijon, in the year 1435, a feast unfolds that will be remembered for centuries. The hall glitters with candlelight reflected in gold plate. Musicians play from a hidden gallery. Each course arrives as theatrical spectacle, a roasted peacock reassembled in its full plumage, a castle constructed from pastry and marzipan, a mechanical lion that walks to the duke's table and roars. Between courses, performers enact scenes from mythology. The guests, dressed in velvets and silks worth small fortunes, recline at tables arranged in precise hierarchical order. Every detail has been choreographed, every moment designed to display the duke's wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. This is late medieval court culture, at its apex elaborate, refined, self-conscious in its magnificence. The Burgundian court, ruling territories spanning modern Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and eastern France, became 15th century Europe's cultural centre. Other courts imitated Burgundian style, its fashions, its ceremonies, its aesthetic sensibilities. The dukes Philip the Good and Charles the Bold competed with kings in splendour, establishing precedents of courtly display that would influence European aristocracy for centuries. Court ceremony became increasingly elaborate. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by Philip the Good in 1430, created chivalric brotherhood, bound by complex rituals. Knights wore distinctive insignia, golden fleece suspended from ornate collar. They swore oaths of loyalty to the Duke and each other. They attended annual chapters where heraldic officers proclaimed each member's achievements, where disputes were arbitrated, where new knights were inducted with ceremonies, blending religious and secular symbolism. This was medieval chivalry's last flowering, preserving knightly ideals even as warfare's realities, gunpowder, professional armies, siege artillery made armoured cavalry increasingly obsolete. Tournaments evolved into Baroque spectacles. Knights still jousted, but now pageantry overshadowed martial display. Participants wore elaborate costumes representing allegorical figures or romance characters. Tournaments might follow narrative threads, knights rescuing imprisoned ladies, defending enchanted castles, undertaking quests. Reality and fantasy blurred in performances that celebrated chivalric ideals while acknowledging their increasing irrelevance to actual warfare. Fashion became art form unto itself. Burgundian courts set trends that spread across Europe. Men wore doublets with padded shoulders, hose in brilliant colours, shoes with exaggerated pointed toes called poulaines, so long they sometimes required chains attaching tip to knee. Women's gowns featured trains extending meters behind, sleeves trailing to the ground, hennins, tall conical headdresses reaching heights that necessitated raising doorways. These fashions proclaimed status. Only the wealthy could afford such impractical clothing. Only those exempt from labour could move in such constrictive garments. Tapestries became major art form, transforming walls into narratives. The unicorn tapestries, woven around 1500, depicted unicorn hunts in intricate detail. Hundreds of species of plants identifiable, each animal rendered precisely, symbolic meanings layered throughout. The Lady and the Unicorn series presented allegory of the five senses through scenes of courtly refinement. These tapestries required years of labour, teams of weavers working from artists' designs, creating textile paintings of astonishing beauty and complexity. Books of hours reached artistic pinnacles. The Trérichausseur du Duc de Berry, begun in 1412, exemplifies the form's heights. The Limbourg brothers created illuminations of jewel-like perfection, calendar pages showing seasonal activities with unprecedented naturalism. architectural backgrounds rendered with mathematical perspective, clothing details revealing contemporary fashion, landscapes capturing specific locations. These were not merely devotional objects, but status symbols, artistic masterpieces, and windows into late medieval life. Private devotion became increasingly important as literacy spread among aristocracy and urban merchant class. Wealthy laypeople commissioned personal books of hours, customized to their preferences, favorite saints, family coats of arms, portraits of owners at prayer. These books allowed spiritual practice independent of communal worship, devotional life tailored to individual needs and schedules. The proliferation of such books reflects broader trend toward religious personalization, toward spirituality experienced individually rather than solely through corporate ritual. Music composition reached extraordinary complexity. Guillaume Dufay, working in the mid-15th century, composed masses and motets that wove multiple melodic lines into elaborate polyphonic structures. His Nuper Rosarum Flores, performed at Florence Cathedral's consecration in 1436, featured 4 voice parts moving in intricate counterpoint, the structure mathematically derived from the cathedral's proportions. This was music as architecture, sound as mathematical relationships made audible, art that appealed simultaneously to ear, intellect, and spirit. Josquin des Prez, active around 1500, brought polyphonic music to even greater heights. His masses featured themes passed between voices like conversations, dissonances carefully prepared and resolved, emotional expressiveness combined with structural sophistication. His Miserere mei, Deus, have mercy on me, O God, sets the penitential psalm with heartbreaking beauty. Rising sequences, creating sense of pleading, intensification, harmonic progressions conveying profound emotion. This is Renaissance music, but it grew directly from medieval polyphonic traditions. Secular songs flourished alongside sacred music. French chansons, Italian frottole, German Lieder composers created sophisticated settings of vernacular poetry. These weren't simple folk songs but courtly art music, employing polyphonic techniques, exploring chromatic harmonies, setting texts by accomplished poets. Music and poetry collaborated, each art enhancing the other. Instrumental music emerged as independent art rather than merely accompaniment for voices. Organs grew larger and more sophisticated, some featuring dozens of stops allowing varied tonal colors. Organ music developed idiomatic writing, exploiting the instrument's capabilities, sustained notes, impossible for singers, rapid passages beyond vocal technique, elaborate ornamentation. The organ became cathedral music's king, its sound filling vast spaces, its presence commanding reverence. Other instruments developed and refined. Lutes gained popularity in courtly chambers, plucked string instruments capable of melody and harmony simultaneously. Viols, bowed string instruments, allowed sustained lyrical lines. Wind instruments, shawms, recorders, crumhorns formed consorts playing polyphonic dances. Percussion provided rhythmic foundation. The late medieval period established instrumental families and techniques that would evolve into modern orchestral tradition. Painting underwent revolutionary transformation through technical innovations. Flemish painters, particularly Jan van Eyck, perfected oil painting techniques allowing unprecedented realism. Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, completed 1434, demonstrates the medium's possibilities, meticulous detail rendering textures of fur and fabric, mirror reflecting the entire room including painter himself, light effects creating three-dimensional space, symbolism embedded in every object. This is painting as window into reality, or perhaps reality transfigured by art into something more perfect than life itself. Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, completed 1432, stands as late medieval art's supreme achievement. The polyptych's multiple panels depict biblical scenes with stunning realism, Adam and Eve rendered with unflinching naturalism, angels singing with mouths open mid-note, the adoration of the Lamb populated by hundreds of figures, each individually characterized. The work synthesizes medieval religious purpose with new Renaissance humanism, technical mastery serving spiritual vision. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, transformed knowledge dissemination more profoundly than any previous invention. Gutenberg's innovation combined several technologies: movable metal type, oil-based ink, modified wine press into system for mechanical reproduction of texts. His 42-line Bible, completed 1455, demonstrated the technology's potential. Within 50 years, printing presses operated across Europe, producing millions of books more than scribes had copied in previous 1,000 years. Early printers focused on religious texts, classical works, legal codes, books certain to sell, but they also printed vernacular literature, scientific treatises, political pamphlets, popular entertainments. The printing press democratized knowledge, broke clerical monopolies on education, enabled ideas to spread rapidly across distances. Luther's Reformation would be unimaginable without printing press, allowing his writings to circulate throughout German-speaking lands within weeks. Universities expanded and multiplied. By 1500, over 80 universities operated across Europe, far more than the dozen existing in 1300. These institutions trained administrators, lawyers, physicians, theologians, the professional class managing increasingly complex societies. University education standardized across Europe, with students moving freely between institutions, all teaching similar curricula, all conferring recognized degrees. Legal education particularly flourished. Roman law, recovered and studied, provided frameworks for organizing societies emerging from feudalism's fragmentation. Legal scholars analyzed ancient codes, adapted them to contemporary conditions, created sophisticated jurisprudence. The reception of Roman law across continental Europe established legal traditions that endure today. Civil law systems descended from these medieval adaptations. Universities also fostered scientific developments. Astronomy advanced through better observations and mathematical modeling. Geography improved as explorers' reports corrected ancient errors. Medicine progressed through anatomical study dissection. Previously forbidden became accepted practice for medical students. Natural philosophy, what we'd call physics, explored motion, optics, and matter's properties. These weren't yet modern science's methodology, remained Aristotelian, explanations often qualitative rather than quantitative, but foundations were being established. Mechanical clocks, appearing in the 14th century, revolutionized time awareness. Previously, time was measured approximately by sun position, by liturgical hours marked by bells, by candles or water clocks. Mechanical clocks, driven by weights or springs and regulated by escapements, kept relatively accurate time, dividing day into equal hours regardless of season. Town halls and cathedrals erected clock towers, bells ringing hours audibly across communities. Time became quantified, segmented, measured, a shift in consciousness with profound implications for work, organization, scheduling, and temporal awareness. Eyeglasses, invented in Italy around 1300, transformed life for aging scholars and craftsmen. Previously declining, vision meant retirement from detailed work. With spectacles, presbyopia could be corrected, extending productive years. Reading glasses became common among educated classes by late medieval period, enabling longer scholarly careers, facilitating manuscript copying and later printing, simply improving life quality for millions. The magnetic compass, adopted from Chinese invention via Islamic intermediaries, revolutionized navigation. Previously, sailors relied on coastal landmarks, celestial navigation, and dead reckoning. The compass allowed sailing when stars weren't visible, maintaining course across open water, exploring beyond sight of land. Combined with improved ship designs and navigational techniques, the compass enabled the age of exploration, Portuguese voyages around Africa, Columbus sailing west, eventually circumnavigation of the globe. Exploration narratives captivated late medieval audiences. Marco Polo's account of travels to China, whether entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, revealed civilizations and wonders previously unknown to Europeans. Tales of Prester John, a mythical Christian king ruling somewhere in Asia or Africa, inspired expeditions seeking alliance against Islamic powers. Travel literature expanded mental horizons, making previously unimaginable distances and differences conceivable. Banking and commerce reached new sophistication. Italian merchant families, Medici, Fuga, others, established international networks, transferred funds across distances through letters of credit financed kings and popes. Double-entry bookkeeping, systematized by Luca Pacioli in his 1494 treatise, provided accounting methods still used today. These techniques enabled commercial expansion, facilitated complex transactions, created financial instruments that would evolve into modern banking. Guilds reached maximum power and elaboration. Master craftsmen controlled production through rigid regulations, who could practice trades, what quality standards must be met, how many apprentices each master could train, what prices could be charged. Guild halls became architectural showpieces. Guilds sponsored religious festivals, maintained chapels, provided social welfare for members. They preserved craft knowledge, maintained quality, protected members' interests, but also resisted innovation and excluded outsiders. Urban life flourished as cities grew wealthy and powerful. Italian city-states Venice, Florence, Genoa competed with kingdoms in wealth and influence. Northern commercial centres Antwerp, Bruges, Lübeck controlled Baltic and North Sea trade. These cities built impressive infrastructure harbours, warehouses, fortifications, civic buildings. They patronized arts, supported universities, commissioned public artworks. Citizenship in such cities brought privileges and pride, urban identity sometimes exceeding regional or national loyalties. Yet alongside urban sophistication, rural life continued largely unchanged. Most people still farmed, followed agricultural rhythms, lived in villages where traditions endured across generations. The brilliant achievements of court culture, the theological sophistication of universities, the commercial innovations of merchant cities, these touched peasant lives only marginally. For villagers, life in 1500 differed little from life in 1200. The seasons still governed everything. The harvest still determined survival. Community and custom still structured existence. But changes were accelerating. The printing press would spread Reformation theology to common people. Exploration would bring global trade networks, affecting even rural communities. Political consolidation would create stronger centralized states. Economic transformations would eventually end feudalism. The medieval world, even as it produced final cultural achievements, was preparing to transition into something fundamentally different. Stand in Burgundy, in 1475. In the ducal palace, polyphonic music echoes during an elaborate feast. In the cathedral, stained glass creates pools of coloured light where worshippers pray before relics. In the town square, merchants conduct business in sight of the cloth hall's soaring belfry. In workshops, craftsmen create objects of beauty and utility, with techniques perfected across generations. In scriptoria now giving way to print shops, knowledge is being recorded and disseminated. In universities, scholars debate theology and natural philosophy. This is medieval civilization's autumn harvest, the final gathering of fruits cultivated across centuries. The beauty is poignant because the season is ending. Winter approaches, and with it transformation so profound that the medieval world will become unrecognizable. but the harvest is real and rich and worthy of wonder. The seeds planted in this autumn would germinate through winter, producing Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, age of exploration, the beginning of modernity. But those developments grew from medieval roots, drew on medieval achievements, transformed rather than rejected medieval heritage. The autumn of the Middle Ages was golden indeed, a season of ripeness and completion, of artistic perfection and intellectual sophistication, of tradition honoured even as innovation beckoned. It was the medieval world at its finest, just before that world passed away. Walk into a university anywhere in the world today, and you walk through medieval doorways. The very word university comes from the Latin universitas, meaning corporation or guild, those associations of masters and students that formed in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford 8 centuries ago. When students wear caps and gowns at graduation, they don medieval academic dress. When they pursue bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees, they follow medieval hierarchies. When professors achieve tenure, they inherit medieval guild protections. The physical campuses, organized around quadrangles with libraries and chapels, echo medieval collegiate architecture. Higher education's fundamental structures remain medieval inventions, adapted but not abandoned, persisting because they work. This is medieval civilization's most surprising legacy, not its disappearance, but its presence. The Middle Ages didn't end so much as transform, contributing essential elements to the world we now inhabit. Like rivers flowing underground, medieval traditions run beneath modern life's surface, occasionally emerging in recognizable forms, more often shaping terrain invisibly but profoundly. Consider the calendar on your wall or phone. The dates are medieval constructions. The 7-day week descends from biblical tradition, preserved through medieval Christianity. Sunday as day of rest, Saturday's Sabbath origin, Wednesday named for Woden, Thursday for Thor, pagan and Christian traditions blended into the temporal structure we accept without questioning. The months retain Roman names, but our holidays are largely medieval creations or adaptations. Christmas, celebrated December 25th, synthesizes Roman winter solstice festivals with Christian nativity commemoration. Many customs we consider traditional decorated evergreen trees, gift-giving, special foods, family gatherings developed during medieval centuries, or were elaborated from medieval precedents. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to Epiphany on January 6th, reflect medieval practice. Caroling descends from medieval wassailing. Even Santa Claus ultimately derives from St. Nicholas, 4th century bishop whose feast day on December 6th became occasion for gift-giving in medieval Europe. Easter's timing follows complex calculations established by medieval church the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. Easter eggs, decorated and hidden, may descend from medieval practices, though evidence is unclear. Easter's association with spring rebirth, with resurrection of nature alongside Christ's resurrection, reflects medieval symbolic thinking that found spiritual meaning in natural cycles. Halloween preserves medieval practices even more directly. All Hallows' Eve, October 31st, the night before All Saints' Day, was when medieval people believed the boundary between living and dead grew thin. Souls in purgatory might walk abroad. Demons prowled. People lit bonfires, wore disguises to confuse malevolent spirits, left food offerings to appease wandering souls. Modern Halloween costumes, trick-or-treating, jack-o'-lanterns descends from these medieval customs, secularized but recognizable. Valentine's Day traces to Saint Valentine, though which of several martyred Valentines remains unclear. Medieval association with romantic love, possibly influenced by Geoffrey Chaucer's poetry connecting Valentine's Day with bird mating season, transformed obscure Saints' Day into celebration of courtly love's descendant romantic partnership. Heart symbols, love notes, gift exchanges all echo medieval courtly love traditions. That elaborate culture of devotion and longing translated into commercial holiday but retaining emotional core. Wedding ceremonies preserve medieval elements throughout. The white dress, though popularized by Queen Victoria, references medieval associations of white with purity. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue may derive from medieval customs. The exchange of rings continues medieval practice, circular form symbolizing eternity, rings blessed by priest before exchange, worn on fourth finger of left hand because medieval people believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. This language comes directly from medieval marriage liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer itself, drawing on earlier Latin texts. Fairy tales we tell children are medieval heritage, preserved through oral tradition, eventually recorded by collectors like the Brothers Grimm. These stories encode medieval worldviews and values. Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood all existed in medieval variants, told around hearths on winter evenings, teaching lessons about virtue rewarded, evil punished, magic intervening in mundane lives, transformations possible through faith and courage. The narrative structures youngest siblings succeeding where older ones failed, tasks set by mysterious figures and magical helpers appearing at need, reflect medieval storytelling conventions and moral frameworks. The forest of these tales is medieval forest, dark, dangerous, enchanted. Medieval people lived close to forests, providing resources, but also harboring threats, wolves, bandits, getting lost. Forests represented wildness just beyond civilization's edge, spaces where normal rules suspended, where magic operated, where transformation occurred. This imaginative geography persists in literature and film. Every enchanted forest in fantasy fiction descends from medieval imagination. Gothic Revival architecture, prominent in 19th century but continuing today, represents explicit medievalism, attempting to recapture Gothic cathedrals' spiritual and aesthetic qualities. Churches worldwide built in neo-Gothic style, pointed arches, flying buttresses, rose windows, soaring vaults testify to medieval architecture's enduring appeal. Secular buildings adopted the style too. Universities, government buildings, even private homes, using Gothic elements to convey tradition, permanence, grandeur. The British Houses of Parliament, rebuilt in 19th century, deliberately chose Gothic style to connect modern governance with medieval precedent. Fantasy literature, from Tolkien onward, draws heavily on medieval sources. Middle-earth incorporates Avrohka, medieval elements throughout feudal social structures, chivalric codes, epic quests, monsters from bestiaries, magic swords and enchanted rings, languages constructed using medieval linguistic principles. Tolkien, a medieval scholar, deliberately created modern mythology, drawing on Anglo-Saxon, Norse and medieval romance traditions. Every fantasy novel featuring knights, dragons, castles, quests, evil overlords, and heroic fellowships owes debt to medieval romance and epic traditions. Role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons construct entire systems based on medievalist fantasy. Character classes, fighter, cleric, wizard, reflect medieval social orders. Armor and weapons derive from medieval warfare. Monsters come from medieval bestiaries. Alignment systems, lawful, neutral, chaotic, good and evil, echo medieval moral frameworks. Magic systems incorporate grimoire traditions and medieval occult practices. These games, and the video games descended from them, introduce millions to medievalist imagination, keeping medieval tropes alive in popular culture. Modern legal systems, particularly in Europe and former European colonies, rest on medieval foundations. The common law tradition in England, developed through medieval court decisions and precedents, spread to British colonies worldwide. Legal concepts we take for granted, trial by jury, habeas corpus, property rights, contract law developed during medieval centuries. The adversarial system, with lawyers arguing opposing sides before impartial judges, evolved from medieval practice. Latin legal phrases habeas corpus, pro bono, amicus curiae testify to medieval legal traditions' continuity. Parliamentary government descends from medieval assemblies. England's parliament evolved from councils where nobles, clergy, and eventually commoners advised the king and approved taxation. Representative government, the principle that rulers require consent of the governed, emerged from medieval political theory and practice. Magna Carta, signed by King John in 1215, established that even kings were subject to law foundational principle for constitutional government. Modern democracies, however different from medieval monarchies, incorporate governmental structures and principles developed during medieval period. Medical terminology retains medieval and ancient roots. Influenza refers to medieval belief that illness was influenced by stars. Quarantine comes from Italian quaranta, 40. The 40 days ships suspected of carrying plague were isolated practice, established during Black Death. Many plant names in medical use preserve medieval herbalists' terminology. The red and white striped barber pole symbolizes medieval barber surgeons who performed bloodletting, red for blood, white for bandages, pole representing staff patients gripped during procedure. Music theory fundamentals were established medievally. The staff notation system, with lines and spaces representing pitches, evolved from medieval neumes marks showing melodic contours in chant manuscripts into modern notation. The major and minor scale systems descend from medieval modes. Much technical terminology is Latin or Italian terms standardized during or after medieval period. Gregorian chant itself persists in Catholic liturgy and influences contemporary composers seeking its austere beauty. Craft guilds' descendants operate still. Trade unions inherit organizational principles from medieval guilds, protecting workers' interests, maintaining standards, providing mutual support. Professional associations of doctors, lawyers, architects function as guilds once did, controlling entry through certification, establishing ethical codes, regulating practice. Apprenticeship systems, though modified, continue medieval patterns. Novices, learning from masters through hands-on experience over years, gradually advancing through skill levels to independence. Universities preserve guild structure most directly. Faculty are organized by departments, essentially guilds of specialties. Tenure functions as guild membership once accepted, difficult to remove. Academic freedom descends from medieval university autonomy. The lecture, where professor reads and comments on authoritative texts, continues medieval pedagogical method. Disputation, though less formal now, persists in thesis defenses and academic conferences. Universities' self-governance, their resistance to external control, reflects medieval corporate independence. Heraldry, the system of coats of arms developed in medieval period, continues in modified form. National flags employ heraldic principles, specific colors, geometric divisions, symbolic animals or objects. Sports teams use heraldic emblems, lions, eagles, crosses, shields. Corporate logos often follow heraldic design principles. The language of heraldry azure and gules for blue and red, rampant for upright animal, charges for emblems remains in use where formal heraldry persists. Chess, played in recognizable form since medieval period, preserves medieval social structure. Kings and queens occupy central importance. Bishops and knights represent clergy and nobility. Pawns are common soldiers or peasants. The piece's movements and relative powers reflect medieval hierarchical thinking. Chess strategy literature, developing from medieval treatises, makes the game intellectual pursuit, connecting contemporary players to centuries of tradition. Playing cards, introduced to Europe in late medieval period, retain medieval court card imagery: kings, queens, jacks, The four suits may originally have represented social classes: swords for nobility, cups for clergy, coins for merchants, batons for peasants, though this interpretation is debated. Card games' social function, entertainment, gambling, courtship ritual continues medieval precedent. Tournaments and jousting, though no longer practical military training, persist as reenactment and sport. Medieval fairs and Renaissance festivals recreate aspects of medieval culture: crafts, costumes, performances, foods. These aren't accurate historical reconstructions, but imaginative engagements with medieval themes, allowing participants and audiences to experience elements of medieval life, however stylized. The pub or tavern as social institution descends from medieval alehouses and inns, places where communities gathered, news was exchanged, business conducted, entertainment enjoyed. The architecture often referenced heavy beams, fireplaces, wooden furniture evokes medieval aesthetics. Even modern bars and restaurants, with no pretense to medievalism, occupy social spaces that medieval alehouses established. Agricultural practices retain medieval elements, especially in traditional farming communities. Crop rotation principles established medievally inform modern organic farming. Heirloom plant varieties preserve medieval cultivars. Traditional livestock breeds, some endangered but protected by enthusiasts, descend from medieval stock. Farmers' markets echo medieval market days, when rural producers brought goods to urban centres. Monasteries continue their medieval functions in modified form. Monastic orders still follow rules established during medieval period. Some monasteries produce goods: cheese, beer, bread, using traditional methods, connecting contemporary consumers to medieval craftsmanship. Monastic hours of prayer continue structuring days of religious communities worldwide. The physical monasteries, many still occupied, serve as bridges connecting present to medieval past. Cathedrals remain living monuments, still serving their intended functions after centuries. Notre Dame de Paris, despite the devastating fire in 2019, is being rebuilt to continue its role. Canterbury, Chartres, Cologne, Santiago de Compostela. These cathedrals still welcome pilgrims and tourists, host worship services, shelter, communities, inspire awe. They are not museum pieces, but active participants in contemporary life, ancient stones housing living traditions. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval civilization established the cultural boundaries and connections of Europe, and, through European expansion, influenced global culture. The concept of Christendom, or the West, despite all its problems and complications, descends from medieval unity under Latin Christianity. University networks, legal traditions, political structures, cultural assumptions about individual rights, representative government, the rule of law, these emerged during medieval period and spread globally through colonialism for good and ill. Even our nostalgia for the Middle Ages is itself medieval trait. People in the 14th century looked back nostalgically to the 12th. The longing for simpler times, for clearer moral frameworks, for enchanted worldviews, for communities bound by tradition, this romantic medievalism has haunted modernity since the Enlightenment. We reject medieval superstition while yearning for medieval certainty. We mock medieval hierarchy while missing medieval community. We celebrate our liberation from medieval constraints while mourning the loss of medieval meaning. The Middle Ages never really ended. They transformed, their elements persisting in altered forms, their influences continuing to shape how we organize society, understand ourselves, imagine alternatives. When we gather for weddings, we enact medieval rituals. When we tell children fairy tales, we transmit medieval wisdom. When we study at universities, we enter medieval institutions. When we celebrate holidays, we observe medieval festivals. When we seek justice in courts, we employ medieval procedures. When we visit cathedrals or castles, we touch stones placed by medieval hands. The medieval world remains present, not as historical curiosity but as living tradition. Its achievements in architecture, literature, music, philosophy, law, and education continue influencing us. Its struggles with questions of authority, community, justice, and meaning mirror our own. Its solutions, some still useful, others outgrown, provide reference points for contemporary debates. Stand in any great cathedral, in Chartres or Canterbury or Cologne. The stones around you were cut by medieval masons. The windows above were set by medieval glaziers. The space was designed by medieval architects. Yet the building lives still, adapted to contemporary needs but recognizably the structure medieval builders intended. Services occur using liturgies descended from medieval worship. Music echoes that medieval composers wrote. People gather for the same reasons medieval congregations gathered, seeking transcendence, community, meaning, beauty. This is what remains of the Middle Ages, not everything, perhaps not even most things, but enough. Enough to remind us that we are not entirely modern, that our roots reach deep into soil medieval hands tilled. Enough to provide alternatives to contemporary assumptions, to show that other ways of organizing society, understanding reality, creating meaning are possible. Enough to inspire us with their achievements, warn us with their failures, connect us to the long human story of which we are latest chapter. The medieval world was different from ours, profoundly so, yet it was recognizably human people loving and fearing, building and destroying, seeking and questioning, creating and preserving. Their solutions to human problems were different from ours, but the problems were often the same. Their achievements inspire us still. Their wisdom, preserved in proverb and story, continues teaching. Their beauty, captured in stone and glass and sound, continues moving us to wonder. The Middle Ages are not gone. They live wherever we tell old stories, celebrate ancient holidays, enter buildings centuries old, follow traditions whose origins we've forgotten. They live in the structures legal, educational, governmental that organize our societies. They live in the questions we still ask about justice, community, authority, meaning, transcendence. The medieval world is with us, yet transformed but present, ancient but alive, different yet familiar. And perhaps that is its final gift, reminding us that we are part of a story longer than ourselves, inheritors of traditions we didn't create but can honor, stewards of wisdom we didn't originate but can preserve, contributors to a civilization that will outlast us as medieval civilization outlasted its creators. The harvest of the Middle Ages continues nourishing us, centuries after those medieval hands planted the seeds. And the seeds we plant today will, in their turn, nourish futures we cannot imagine, in a great continuity connecting past, present, and future in the eternal human endeavor to create meaning, beauty, justice, and community. This is what the Middle Ages have given us. This is what remains.